afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Henri. So delighted to present Henri today. He's going to talk about his dissertation and those online as well. Thank you so much for being here. So I met Henri a few years ago now. I think you were still at Whitewater in the budget office and was interested in the DBA, and here we are today. So Henri actually has a bachelor's in economics from Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and then got an MPA at the Illinois Institute of Technology in 2015. From day one, I remember he was interested in nonprofits, and so he's talking about some alternative measures of performance and looking at the impact of networks and so on these nonprofits. And so at the moment, Henri is the Chief Business Officer for Student Affairs at UW-Madison. So take it away, Henri.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Praveen, for the kind introduction. And also thank you to the other fine folk in the room. Couldn't have done this without you both, you, Garrett, especially in the data analysis. I really appreciate your direction and guidance throughout this process, and Ruth as well. I think having that grounded theory is, we talked, and there's some even degrees of separation in our professional lives too, from Chicago. So that's been a pleasure. But most of all, Praveen, your steadfastness and also pushing, kindly as of course, has really helped me get across the finish line. To my family and friends who may be watching this afternoon, couldn't have done it without your help as well, especially my wife, Monica, who wasn't able to make it today, but has been a constant help and also a push to get me across the finish line. So, to begin my study today, I have always been interested in different nonprofits. Both on a professional and personal level, but something that I've always been confounded by is just the breadth of nonprofits in the United States. So about 6 years ago, the latest reliable records, a little over 1.5 million nonprofits existed in the United States. If you think about it, there are 330 million people in the United States, so that's a pretty big ratio. They're very wide-reaching. Almost $2.6 trillion in annual revenues, so that's very wide-reaching and a large base, and nearly $6 trillion in assets. So again, very large. In terms of employment, 1 out of every 10 workers in the United States is directly employed by a nonprofit. And nearly 6% of GDP is generated by these organizations. Within that, private donations, so just gifts that you or I or others could give, totaled over $400 billion annually. Most nonprofits, especially those on the smaller end, consider these essential to their operations. So that's a great resource, especially for the smaller ones. They do run on shoestring budgets. It's very essential. On the issue of size and scope, only about 8% of nonprofits have revenues greater than $1 million. If I were to take a look at the existing research on that, kind of the opposite. Most research isn't on these larger nonprofits. Very little bit is on the smaller ones. And on the smaller ones, 3/4 have less than $100,000 in annual revenues. So that's something to keep in mind. I also want to just chat a little bit about the differences between the nonprofit sector and the for-profit sector. By definition, there are no shareholders, and any surplus or monies left over at the end of the year are reinvested back into the organization through a variety of different ways, and are directly related to its mission, which is something that's really important to me. Oops, sorry. So again, I'm always interested, more of a visual person, and I think this is just another way to conceptualize or visualize the data. The vast majority of organizations, do either have no revenues, very small revenues, and only a small portion, about 8%, have greater than $1 million million in annual revenues. So there's also a great research opportunity there because nearly over 90% of the firms really aren't touched in the research space, and that's something that I'm interested in looking forward to. So I'd say I have some experiential learning when it comes to nonprofits. I've benefited from personally, I've volunteered for, I've worked for, I've served on the boards of various nonprofits, and I found that many individuals are motivated, especially those employees. They're dedicated to the cause, very motivated to ensuring proper outcomes, but they don't necessarily know how to run an organization. I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean that they lack the management capabilities to effectively run an organization. That also presents another research opportunity because to the extent that there's kind of that lack of management or a lack of linkage between the management field and the nonprofit field, into how organizations become more effective, that's certainly warrant further study. Ultimately, as a practitioner, anything that we can do and I can provide practical results to organizations, I'm very, very interested in learning more. So, just a kind of a general overview of everything. We talked about some of the challenges that nonprofits face, ensuring sustainable business models, especially on the smaller scale. If many of your revenues are incumbent upon people donating or other just the beneficiaries of generosity, if you will. Exploring into other revenue streams is really important. Any resources that we can get into the organization are better. That definitely helps us fulfill our mission. The other challenge with that, though, we talked about it in the previous slide a little bit. Especially the smaller organizations, they lack proper management capabilities. They're are very dedicated to the cause, but aren't necessarily apt at developing some of these entrepreneurial activities. So my study, we do seek to analyze different characteristics when it comes to the board members. How those organizations can structure their nonprofit board is very important. That's something that we'll seek later on, and also talking about some of the kind of different metrics that we can develop for measurement of different nonprofit performance. My study evaluates different structures that organizations can have. For looking at these board characteristics, I do look at publicly available tax records that are out there for any nonprofit organization. I do talk about financial performance as an outcome. Especially in the nonprofit setting, that's a very imperfect measure. I'll get into why that might be later in my presentation. But at least for this study, we measure financial performance as a measure of operational effectiveness. But I will get more into that later in my slides. But again, I'm looking to provide both study into the wider field of knowledge, but also guidance for these organizations. So have several research questions that we'd like to address throughout this study. First of all, I'm examining what interplay exists between social entrepreneurship and nonprofit firms. Social entrepreneurship, these can be nonprofits, but generally they're for-profit organizations that seek to derive some sort of societal benefit and create a profit. And I'm interested in what linkages exist between these organizations and between the research fields of social entrepreneurship and nonprofits. And again, the premise is, there's an opportunity to generate greater revenues to create more resources and fulfill the basic needs of the organization. So also interested in taking a look at the different characteristics of how a nonprofit structures its board of trustees. Every nonprofit leads at least a minimum of 3 board members, a president, a secretary, and a treasurer. Many have more than that, some far more than that. But at the very minimum, how these organizations go about fulfilling and recruiting for missions. And my underlying argument in this is that a board that is very involved in the organization can help contribute to the organizational success of a nonprofit. And finally, I'm curious to figuring out what relationships exist between these different board members. If there's outside business ideas that we can bring in, and again help generate resources for the organization. So I have several hypotheses. My first is that management capabilities positively impact network dynamics. So for management capabilities, I've defined this and have grounded this in existing literature. That is essentially a propensity of an organization to be open to outside perspectives or outside inputs in order to run its organization. Again, the underlying theory is if you're more open to outside ideas and new ideas, that will benefit you in the overall organization. And deliver those extra resources so that we can fulfill our mission. Network dynamics, this is a proxy that I've established related to the board, or the board and oversight committees. And again, this essentially argues that our board members, our key employees, have a vested interest in the success of the organization. And I've tied to that some other financial measures as well that we'll get into later today. My second hypothesis, which has two subparts, that ultimately this network dynamics component, so a strong board and strong oversight committee does positively influence financial performance. So the financial performance, that's kind of the name of the game, and again an imperfect measure, but a measure nonetheless. My subpart, or my H2A that I've identified here, we talk about the change capacity of organizations and how that creates essentially an additional feedback loop to generate additional resources. Business process change capacity would be another way of saying dynamic capabilities. So the ability of the firm or organization to pivot or engage in new resources across its field, and again engaging in supplemental entrepreneurship activities. So you can kind of think about this as like the outward-facing portion of my argument here. My third hypothesis relates more to the inward facing, so the internal controls portion of my hypotheses were network dynamics, so that strong board positively influences financial reporting quality. My proxy for financial reporting quality in this measure is financial statements, so whether or not a firm submits a tax record and then for whatever reason has to submit another tax record, that generally showcases a lack of internal controls, and that also focuses more on the for-profit sector. So I posit there were to the extent that there's a more involved board, there would be fewer financial statements, stronger internal controls, ultimately leading to better financial performance. So this relates to that whole how we know how to run an organization activity. So again, taking a look at our research model, I'm positing that management capabilities, so the ability of the organization, the organization's employees to be open to outside perspectives, helps them recruit and retain better oversight in terms of their board of trustees and other key employees. This also creates positive on the top here. On the top here, that stronger board does help us create, makes us more open to new ideas, to new business activities. And again, outwardly facing allows us to generate more resources, reflected here on the right of the screen, for that financial performance. At the same time, to recap my third hypothesis, that stronger board and oversight should lead to improved financial reporting quality. So fewer financial restatements, stronger internal controls, which also does help out our overall financial performance. So I do have to state this past winter I was in front of several folk, and I thought I'd have a bit of an easier time gathering data. So I think that was one of my biggest challenges over the past few months. But I am glad I was able to access it, staring under my nose the whole time. But the Internal Revenue Service creates available to the public for anyone, available for download, tax information, tax records for all nonprofit organizations. This is a varying level depending on the size and scope of the nonprofit. But if you do have a nonprofit, no matter how big or how small, and you have that tax exempt status, the IRS has tax records for this. So, there are several different kinds of tax forms that nonprofits do have to give, are required to give. The full Form 990, which contains 12 different sections, hundreds of different questions and submissions for different financial data, is required for all nonprofits with greater than $200,000 in annual revenues, and that's where my study has focused on. So, available for download isn't the full data set, and that was one of the challenges, but through the use of proxies, and again, I have to thank Garrett for his guidance and helping helping with this. There are 246 different variables that are available for organizations that submit the full Form 990. These are various binaries, so yes, no, various string numbers with very detailed revenue information, expense information, firm characteristics, organizational focus, and really a breadth of information. So I'm glad we were able to download that. Now, as I stated earlier, I'm really interested in the smaller nonprofits. So as I was selecting data, through this process, I started with firms in my first year, and I'll get later into what that selection is. I wanted firms that had at least $200,000 in annual revenues, because that means they have to fulfill the full Form 990. And because of the lack of information on smaller nonprofits, I established $1 million in annual revenues as a cap for my beginning year, because again, I wanted to look at the smaller nonprofits. I limited my selection of submissions to organizations that submit tax records from the years 2016 to 2020. The IRS backdates those returns, so a year, if you download a data file from 2016, that'll generally have 2015 and prior information, so there's a year lag in that. But I wanted to stop at 2020, so that 2019 tax year, mainly because of COVID. There are, and we're still dealing with the impacts of the pandemic. And 2020 was a difficult year for many nonprofits for many different reasons. 2021, also, was difficult. And I didn't want to, have those years really influence my my output. The IRS also only has returns through 2023, so I might have been able to take a look at 22. But again, I didn't want to skip the years, so I looked at tax year 2015 to 2019. I only evaluated full year tax returns, so the IRS database contains mid-year submissions. If organizations have a fiscal year that doesn't align with the calendar year, that would also be reflected in the IRS database. The challenge is that I'm not able to identify, unless I would reach out to the firm directly, whether that submission was a restatement, whether it was a mid-year, some sort of mid-year submissions, or whether it was part of their fiscal year. So I only looked at firms that looked at that full calendar year for their submission. So overall, my data set contained over 363,000 unique records over this time period, so it was a pretty robust study. Originally, I was hoping to use a bit of a different, a bit of different information than I had. But through the use of proxies, I was able to establish a couple different variables or proxies for my variables. The first would be the definition of management capabilities. So there's a question that asks if and to what extent external management partners are involved. Again, getting along the lines of if you're engaging in external management, so outside voices to impact how you run your organization, you're likely more open to change. Within my data set, I found a little over 20,000 records for that. Within networking effects, so those board relationships, the Form 990 asks, essentially if there are gifts or receivables, meaning your trustees and/or your key employees gave money, or if they had receivables, meaning I'm going to give you money, it's the checks in the mail, for lack of a better term, and the justification for that, which again is backed up in my literature as well, that there's a vested interest from the board members and key parties. So a little over 3,600 records for networking effects. For dynamic capabilities, there's a question that asks if and to what extent the firm had revenues unrelated to its organizational business purpose. So in the for-profit sector, in the nonprofit sector, we would call that unrelated business income. Again, meaning that the organization is nominally engaged or potentially substantively engaged in generating revenues above and beyond donations and other activities. An example would be something like a school or an education thing. They might get tuition or some sort of gifts, but if they sell baseball hats for a fundraising or something like that, that's an unrelated business income. But it also shows that they're able to look at other resources for or above and beyond their traditional revenues. A little over 20,000. Opportunity for further research. Well, I will talk further. I'd be interested to see how this breaks out just across different organizational focus for that. Financial reporting quality. This would be relates to restatements. So if an organization does, for whatever reason, resubmit their tax records for a certain time period, that would be evidence of a restatement. I'll get into that a little more later today. And again, financial performance. This is an imperfect measure, and I understand that when we talk about nonprofit success and nonprofit operating performance. However, it's the most publicly available and grounded, if you will, record that we do have access. And I'm looking at the time series change in revenues over that 5-year period for this measure. So again, time series analysis over the selected time period. I calculated that change using the IRS data. So if a firm had $200,000 a year in 2015, at the end of it they had $300,000. That change in revenue would be calculated over that time. I use Stata as a statistical tool to analyze all my different data elements using a variety of different methods, mostly using a regression analysis. And again, excluding those mid-year financial statements because for a variety of different reasons. So my first interaction examining management capabilities and networking dynamics. So again, a firm's ability to be open to outside perspectives and board of trustee and strong board and employee involvement. I was happy to find a positive and significant relationship, very significant. So that did lend support to my first hypothesis. And I found this was expected. So that did show promise for the rest of my study, and warranted push me to keep going, I guess you could say. The next part of my study, examining those strong board characteristics, or the networking dynamics and the dynamic capabilities of the firms, the ability to engage in outside activities. And again, there were proxy variables that were established. That also showed a positive and significant relationship within R squared of many out many decimal places, so that was promising, lending support to that hypothesis. But also under support of the underlying idea that an involved board and organization does have the ability to influence the organization ability to engage in these outside business activities. To the extent that those dynamic capabilities and change capacity is involved, that does have a positive impact on financial performance, which again was a positive and significant impact on the financial performance. Again, this was expected. We did ground this in our literature, of course, as we were developing, but that was a positive development. Also examining the financial reporting quality aspects are kind of the bottom screen of my third hypothesis. Essentially positing that a involved board with involved management would lead to fewer financial restatements. So I didn't expect this to be a negative relationship, meaning more board involvement would lead to fewer restatements or resubmissions. And I did find that negative relationship, but it was not significant with a p-value of 0.36. There are several reasons why. I think there could be. I'll get into that a little later. There was directionality, but unfortunately there wasn't support, so I could not reject the null for this. Finally, on the bottom of the screen, examining the financial reporting quality and financial performance, I did expect a positive relationship with this, but again, it was also insignificant with a p-value of 0.31. I suspect that this is because of my prior results being insignificant. This would carry forward into this interaction, and I have a few ideas that we'll get into a little later. So, ultimately, I did find support for my first hypotheses, which was great. That an organization, essentially an organization that is open to outside perspectives, is vested, does create a symbiotic feedback loop with its board. So that was very promising to see support there. Similarly, I found support for my second hypothesis and subparts where the network dynamics did positively influence that financial performance. I think this does, again, lend further support that strong board relationship brings into account the ability to look outside for additional resources and ultimately deliver additional financial resources for the organization to fulfill its mission. So that was promising. Unfortunately, I didn't find support for my third hypotheses and subparts. The result, there was directionality there, but unfortunately it was insignificant. And I'll get into a little later, potentially why. But that was a bit of a surprise to me. So, originally I set out to analyze, different, social networks or how, organizations can construct their operations, recruit boards to, get, influence financial performance and deliver additional resources for their organization. And I think we did find that. So. Overall, there was support for board and stakeholder involvement, and we did show that support on the financial performance. So I'm happy to see that, and I kind of lends support to what we were originally thinking, but also opens up many future possibilities for future study. As I mentioned earlier, there was directionality for my third hypothesis and subpart, but the results were insignificant. I posit that restatements can be for many different reasons. It could be something as material as excluding some sort of revenue line, and there's a big change or big expense that was missed. It could be something as insignificant as a name change. If the director's name was John, it was spelled Jon on the form, but it's really John. And if someone's a stickler, they could restate that for some reason. So I didn't analyze those firm level variances or any of those the reasons that would necessitate financial performance, but it's also an opportunity for future study. I will note that in for-profit settings, there was actually a bit of carryover. So if an executive, or the literature has shown support that if an executive works at a firm that does experience a financial restatement, so kind of a restatement in their for-profit setting, they're actually more involved in post-disclosure activities at nonprofits. So if, for example, an executive is serving on a nonprofit and for whatever reason there are financial, not necessarily financial issues, but issues with an audit or things that would cause a financial restatement at their for-profit firm in their everyday life, they're more involved in the finances of the nonprofits in which they serve. So you could kind of think this: if you're a stickler at work, you could be a stickler, with a nonprofit. That's one potential reason, but again, I think it does warrant further study to figure out potentially what's going on there. So, I think my study, I'm glad that, we were able to move forward. There was support there. But I'm also thinking about there's so much more out there with this. I think one of my challenges that I did note earlier was related to the availability of data. We were able to justify many of those original elements through the use of proxies. But the publicly available information from the IRS is really only about half of the full form. The full form contains 12 different subsections. One component that I was really interested in examining related to different management and governance sections. Much of that data was binary, so I was looking forward to using that in a quantitative analysis in this study. Unfortunately, that section isn't available. All forms are queryable, so if we had 363,000 records, I theoretically could query individually 363,000 different nonprofits and manually key those in. But I think a potential more limited study would be helpful in the future. Another limitation that I will readily recognize relates to the pandemic. My data set does stop in 2019, so this was several years ago. I'd be interested in seeing what changes or what has changed over the prior years, but also knowing that I did want that time series of data. I really wanted to take a look over a 5-year time period. That presented some challenges to stay, and I will note that because the results are more current. I talked about future research. I think examining that part 6, so as it relates to different management information, different abilities to better examine those structures is certainly a valuable part. I think that if we were to right now, I just have kind of flying clicker. Right now, I've kind of grouped all nonprofits in as this weird nebulous figure. And I think further study, if I were to break out to see how the results show between different organizational focuses, whether they're community benefit organizations or educational, there are many others. I think that's definitely warrant of a future study. Most importantly, and I think most interestingly though, if I were to undertake some sort of survey or qualitative analysis of the data, I think that could be kind of interesting. So potentially take a few case studies from some of the more interesting organizations I found in this study, and potentially reach out to those units or groups, if you will, could show some promise and show some very interesting information, I feel like. So yeah. But again, thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I welcome questions in the group.
All right, great job, Henry.
Right.
Thank you so much. I know
Thank you.
how hard you worked on this, and good to see the results. I know some challenges came in the way, so I think my first question is more general. We kind of went through the ins and outs of the paper and we tackled those, but I think your data kind of collection experience and so on would be of lesson to future dissertators. So you kind of created the study based on thinking that the data would be available, and then it wasn't. Tell students a little bit about what that was like and how you found a way out, because at some point you were even thinking of maybe potentially having to send out questionnaires and so on, right?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the great question. And again, through the program, we've talked about data always being a challenge. I think my biggest takeaway, it's one thing to talk about, it's another thing to actually confront it face on. So originally, I did do a pilot study prior to digging in further, and I found a vendor that allowed query access to all nonprofit organizations, especially that governance section that I really wanted to get at. This was about a year ago when I first engaged with them, but unfortunately, about 5 or 6 months later, when it was actually time to run the full analysis, the firm stopped offering the service. And it was a paid service, which is fine, but they're, unfortunately, that's just not a service that they offer anymore. So I think, guidance would definitely be, again, based on my personal experience, really make sure before you think you know what you're going to do, make sure you have that solid data set. I did, consider doing more of a survey or, potentially even interviews with, a much smaller subset of nonprofits to talk about their experiences. As I mentioned, I have a pilot study, so I have, potentially some organizations to talk out to. As I further thought about that, though, I think, time came an issue. To the extent that you engage in surveys and interviews, you're potentially looking at an extra, many months involved in that. But I truthfully, if I could, I'll say so to those attending online as well. I was really within about a day of doing that. Before I was able to come across a different way, and again looking at the different way. So I'd also say that we're still looking at data. We're still looking at good data. It's a little more challenging to establish those proxies, but again, we were able to ground that both in theory as well as a practice, which is really important to me, and I'm glad we were able to do it. So yes, there's great opportunity for further study, maybe through those surveys or interviews, but it's still some great opportunity out there.
All right, thank you. So the other thing is, you talked about, within the sample, you looked at only the companies that had 200,000 to 1 million. What percentage of the whole sample was that, and did you play around with the other ones? And especially considering that, you had non-significant findings in some areas, did you look at the other areas?
Yeah, absolutely. So great question. So keep in mind that 75% of nonprofits either show zero revenues or less than $100,000 in revenues. And again, I don't have it in front of me. I'd be happy to talk or to come back with that. But I believe when it comes to the full Form 990, it was a little over half. So again, that includes organizations that have more than $1 million in revenues, and that kind of the 200 to $1 million sweet spot, if you will. I think it was about half. I have the numbers, and I'd be happy to follow up with you, though.
Okay. And final question, more practical. So if you were, you said you've been on boards and so on. If you had to share one major message from what you've done to nonprofit leaders and so on, what would that be?
Again, that's a very, very good question. Recruit and engage your board members. I think that's very, very important. My studies shown the importance of having an engaged board from a diverse background, both in diversity, but also diversity in different experiences. And I think designing your board is just about the most important thing you can do.
So hi, I know a lot of work has gone into this, and I know that at least for me, every research project seems like it never really finishes.
Yeah.
You reach a point, right, where you're like, okay. I do have some questions on this. So you mentioned that the 990s. I want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly. You took the ones that filed in December and did not take the ones that filed on a July 1, June 30 fiscal year. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. One of the challenge, well, a few, if I may, for smaller nonprofits, and again, some somewhat based on personal experience, it shows up in the literature a little bit as well. For smaller nonprofits, the calendar year is often the fiscal year. It doesn't have to be. It absolutely does not have to be. It could also, be others as well. Some follow the federal government fiscal year of October 1st to September 30th. Many follow the state fiscal year of July 1st to June 30th. Unfortunately, within the data set, I'm not able to find whether or not it's comprises their full fiscal year or not. So I did have to limit results to just that time frame.
So it sounds like there was a really good logistical, like practical reason for doing that. In my experience, I've primarily seen organizations that use that July 1, June 30 year. And so I was wondering, like what percentage of the organizations did that wind up excluding? And how do you think this likely affected your results?
Yeah, and again, I do not have the numbers off the top of my head, so I'd be happy to follow up with you on that in lieu of sprouting out numbers. But that's a good question, what the effect might be. It's I think the challenge is ensuring that I get that the full year of results, whatever that year may be. That was really my goal in this study. I understand that fiscal years are different for every organization. Some follow the calendar year. Again, some, especially those that get state grants, are and other grants are based on a July 1st fiscal year. But there is the potentially, especially if it aligns either with the federal government or the state government, potentially organizations that are more reliant on those grants could be affected. So social service organizations or others that are engaged in those activities. But really, it was my goal of just looking at the calendar year returns was again to focus on ensuring that it was a full fiscal year or a full calendar year. Sorry.
Okay, second follow-up question, also a data question. Obviously, religious organizations, churches are not included in those 990s. Do you have any idea what effect that would have on, and I realize that you were not able to observe, but if you were to include it in a limitation, what would your hypothesis be on how that would affect your results?
Yeah, and again, Ruth, like it or not, I immediately jumped to kind of the practical implications of many of these, again, like a food kitchen or something, some of these service organizations. I also think about within the management field how individuals are motivated. to do whatever it is that they do, because if there's a religiosity, something that's kind of drives your ability to participate and donate and engage with a religious organization, those motivations are a little different. And that's a good thing. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. But I would be interested in learning how, what the board relationship would look like in those organizations. I think that's, ultimately the board that, is so important. That's, what my study is kind of, shown and, what I'm trying to get at. But I would be really interested in looking at, those different kind of characteristics within religious organizations. Unfortunately, they're not available, of course.
So in some ways, that was a completely unfair question.
Oh, no.
So my last question, can you walk me through the relationship of your research questions to your hypotheses? I see a really strong connection between your hypotheses and the research model. But when I look at the research questions, many of those seem quite broad to me, and I don't fully understand the connection with the hypotheses. Could you walk me through that?
Yeah, sure. So ultimately, and again, my study's kind of evolved over the last few years, and I say few years, but I think if I could, and again, paint those broad strokes, taking kind of the general idea or the general topics that I'd like to address and getting them down into my hypothesis. I think that's kind of the question. I'm interested in examining how social entrepreneurship, so how we can kind of drive these outside activities, how it can drive additional resources into the organization. I mean that's one of the things that I think, and again, I can probably do better on as well. But ultimately, I am interested in how the organization operates more effectively. And I will note I could probably be more specific in terms of some of those research questions as well.
Well, okay, so like just to be more specific,
Yeah.
from the study that you did, I'll just take research question 2. What does your study tell us about how organizations can use existing relationships with board members to improve their financial performance?
Yeah, so great question. I think and I could have done a better job explaining this in my presentation today. But what I'm really trying to drive at is how boards can become more effective and how those engaged board members can help drive additional resources to the organization. That is my goal.
So would you have any recommendations for organizations on how they can use those board member relationships to improve their financial performance?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think diversity is very important, especially of different backgrounds. And again, recruiting board members that are going to be engaged, not just those that are, on a board to be on a board. But those are really organizations, or trying to recruit to the best of your ability, or the best of the nonprofit's ability, board members that are going to be engaged in the organization, invested in that operation.
Thanks. Garrett?
Hello. So I had just a couple fairly straightforward questions, just related to the summary statistics of the paper.
Yep.
So things like, what was the average revenue of your sample? What was like the average number of employees? Those kinds of things. How does your sample look compositionally?
Yeah, absolutely. So, thanks. And I have the tables, somewhere, and I'd be happy to share them with you both on the screen. Right about $368,000 was the average annual revenue. I didn't include employee count. That was from a different, so that's actually, at least in my data set, wasn't available in that. I think that'd be a really important data set, though. And I should have added, starting at $200,000, an organization likely has some sort of employee or professional management. And that was just kind of another justification for starting at that level. Unfortunately, employee count is not available in my data set.
So then just a follow-up on that. So you had mentioned, and I know back in your proposal even, I thought it would be helpful to look at the organization type by broad categories, right? So in your samples, do you have a sense of what the composition looks like, or do you have more? I can't even think. I mean, like hospitals would probably not be part of it because they're going to have revenue outside of your range. But kind of what's in there, or is there a group or two that seems like it was dominating your sample?
Yeah. So again, there were 363,000 and change organizations. Within my particular data set, it was, yeah, so I just back up a step. So the IRS has come up with something called a NTEE code that lists, or that indicates the organizational focus, so that like social benefit or education or childcare. I don't have the specifics off the top of my head, but there was actually a data limitation in my analysis to incorporate that into my database. So it's an opportunity for future research for that. So I do not have a good breakout of that, and it's outside of the scope of the study. I'm not saying it wouldn't be worthwhile, but yeah.
That's perfectly fine. I was just curious. So then the last, we'll just call it a comment. Comment question. So this is more of a personal opinion, right? So there are some scholars who argue, or who make an argument, we'll put it this way, that using standard statistical analysis, like I usually do, like we have in our study, perhaps is not providing or giving the answer to the questions that we would want. So when you're looking at your findings that you present in your paper, you're actually looking at the average effect. So given X, on average, what happens to Y? But if you want to provide best practices, for instance, to nonprofits, we might not want the average effect. We might want what's the effect of the top 10% or the top 20%, because those organizations might have figured out like the thing to do. So again, that's more of a comment. I guess the question is, do you have a opinion on that one way or the other, or, kind of given that information, I don't know. How do you feel about that?
Thanks for the comment. I can't see how that can hurt. I've kind of been saying like, or something you might have heard me say this afternoon and before, is I'm interested in, what do we need to do well, and what would do even better. So, if we did highlight, if you will, those top 10% or, 20%, you know, I think that's absolutely something, but I can think of two immediate implications. First of all, what a great group to reach out to for some sort of survey or some sort of, you know, further engagement, to figure out, you know, exactly, you know, what they're doing. I think that's, you know, a great, you know, a great example. But, you know, even if we don't reach out to them, if I were to able to analyze, you know, through, you know, NTE codes, you know, where those success stories lie, I think that could be an interesting story as well. So, yeah, if we didn't do the qualitative component.
Excellent. Thank you.
Right. You know, I'm not sure if we have any questions on the Facebook page. Usually we don't, so I'll kind of assume we are good now. So thank you.
All right. Well,
Yeah,
thank you.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, yeah, no, thank you.